Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Mikhail Thorpe, and this is the Expat Money Show. Today's guest is the CEO and co-founder of Strategic Wealth Preservation, an international precious metals dealer and secure storage provider headquartered in the Cayman Islands. Please welcome to the show, Mark Yaxley. Mark, how are you?
Hey, Mikhail, I'm doing well. Good to see you.
You as well. Now, why don't we kind of take a minute? Because I was kind of bugging you before our episode. I want to understand a little bit about the history of your company, how you ended up in precious metals. I'm very curious. Let's go through all of it.
I started in precious metals back in 2006. I was living at the time in Montreal, where I grew up. Some people might know about this company called Kitco Precious Metals, pretty big Canadian outfit. They're famous for their spot price. I ended up landing a job there, like I said, in 2006. I was 26 years old. Fast forward 8 years later, I moved on from Kitco and co-founded SWP, Strategic Wealth Preservation, in the Cayman Islands, which is a place that I didn't know a whole lot about, but my two partners were from there, were living there at the time. And they invited me to come down, check out Cayman. And the moment I set foot on that beautiful island, I knew that it would be a great experience. And we launched SWP officially to the world in 2015. So we're coming up on our 10-year anniversary in not too long.
So you literally came to Cayman's to start the vault, opposed to which would have been my guess is you came to Cayman's, saw a need for a vault, and then decided to fill a need.
Well, my partners saw the need. They started planning SWP in about 2012. So they visited different vaults, including one in Panama that you'd be familiar with. They visited vaults in Miami, New York City, and they recognized need. Cayman had basically everything you can imagine in terms of financial services. That's really what it's, what it makes its bread and butter off of is financial services. But they didn't have a gold vault of any substantial size. They didn't have a gold dealer that had any kind of real liquidity or purchasing power in Cayman. And so the idea was born, and then they needed a gold guy. So they recruited me. I had dealt with them previously through my time at Kitco.
Okay, so I want to get into the vault and the facility and all of these types of things. But before we get into the precious metals side of things, why Cayman? Like, why would someone care about the Cayman Island? There's many countries in the Caribbean and then, in the Atlantic, and, what makes Cayman special?
Well, there's some basic things you'd want to think about. First of all, like safety, security would be one of them. Cayman has a very low crime rate, in part due to the fact that their standard of living is actually quite high. People are well educated. Unemployment is low. So you have kind of those base socioeconomic features that make the island attractive, not only for precious metals, but for a lot of financial services. Obviously banks also want to set up in a place that doesn't have a lot of corruption, where the government is stable and, there's not a lot of crime and fraud and things like that in general. So Cayman checks all of those boxes. But when I answer this question, I generally allude to a very simple humanistic fact. And sometimes it's hard for people to wrap their heads around this, but I find it to be very, very true, having lived in Cayman for a number of years, is that the people of the Cayman Islands, true Caymanian people born and raised, they understand very, very well that their international reputation as a financial services district is what allows them to enjoy a very high quality lifestyle and send their kids to good schools and have happy lives in general. So when it comes to businesses like SWP, the government, who's representative, obviously, of the people to a certain extent, at least, they understand that they're going to support these businesses and they're going to help promote these businesses because it helps promote the jurisdiction's reputation. And they don't, for example, write laws that interfere or make, business in general more difficult, or, allow any type of corruption or things like that. So really, it's because the Cayman Island nationals understand the benefits that foreign businesses or businesses that are domestic to Cayman, like our own, that's born and raised in Cayman, is good for it's good for the island. And so they support it. And they do that really well. And the government also does it very well. It's not only the lawyers and the accountants, it's also the government that support the businesses, which is great.
Okay, so on your first point about safety, I agree with you. I think it's incredibly important. Now, a lot of people, when they think of the Caribbean, they're just thinking of beach resorts and things like that. But actually, a lot of people don't realize that in the Caribbean, there's actually can be a lot of poverty. There can be a lot of travel with crime. I don't know which country to pick on, but you could take a place, I don't know, maybe like Trinidad and Tobago, where they do have legit crime problems in that country. I'm sure I have Trinidad and Tobagoan listeners out there, and I mean no offense by any of this, but there are some countries in the Caribbean that have a rougher side to them. Now, as you rightly pointed out, Cayman, maybe doesn't have these types of problems, which puts you in a position. And I would argue that they don't have a lot of those problems because of a lot of the foreign direct investment that comes into the country. Mm. I also think that it's very interesting that you point out that the people actually recognize that the foreign direct investment actually benefits everybody there. So it is a rising tide lifts all boats types of situation, because whenever you have a government who ends up starting, who pointing their finger at expats and foreign investment and, money coming into the country, that becomes very problematic. And I've seen that in a number of countries around the world. As I pointed out on a recent episode in Portugal, it was an expat hotspot and there were so many people going there and so much money moving in. And now this new socialist government is really pointing their finger at the expats and calling out that they're the problem. And I think that this is going to be an real problem going forwards for the country. So I'm glad to hear that Cayman understands that foreigners and money coming in is actually a good thing and helps the local population.
Absolutely, for the most part. I mean, you're always going to have extreme views. You're going to have some expats that don't respect locals, whether it be in Cayman or whether it be in any country that they choose to live in. I've seen that firsthand. And you're going to have some locals that, don't necessarily like foreigners coming to their country. That's understandable, but that also happens in towns in Canada that you relocate to from the city, and the locals are like, "Oh, we don't want city folk in our town." So that's a human trait, I would say, more than anything else. But you look at Bermuda as an example where it is less welcoming. It's a country that did very, very well financially for a long time. They have a very strong financial services community, and I'm not criticizing Bermuda or picking on them, but you do hear that there's strong animosity between the local population and a much significantly smaller expat population. Cayman's done a good job. They have a really interesting policy where they have a very diverse international crowd that comes to Cayman. Like most people probably think it's British lawyers and Canadian, I don't know, bartenders or whatever Canadians do when we go work in other countries, right? But they have like over 140 nationalities represented on an island. And in terms of visa applications, they actually give more points in terms of their PR applications, they give more points to people that are less represented on the island because they don't want too many of one particular group on the island are kind of taking over running the show. So I always found that to be very interesting. And it leads to some good conversations over bottles of wine because your friends are from all over the world. So good perspective.
100%. Well, on this program, my audience will know that I am always pushing to have respect and show respect for the local population. This is not just how you talk to people and treat people, but show respect by learning the local language, understanding a bit about the culture, the history, making local friends, actually going out of your way to really show that you want to be part of the community. As I've said 1,000 times, this is not the digital nomad money show or something like that. This is the expat money. That means that we actually want to integrate ourselves and learn about the country and the culture. And I think if you go in with a humble attitude, you're going to have a better experience all around. And I think that the local population, in most cases, are going to be a lot more receptive for you being in the country.
Absolutely. From my experience in Cayman, when I moved to Cayman, it's the first time I lived in the Caribbean. One of my partners did most of his Friday afternoon drinking at a very local bar. And I remember going in there the first time and thinking to myself, wow, I feel out of place. I mean, most of the people drinking at this bar are Jamaican. Most of these Jamaican guys are blue collar workers. I'm a white collar guy from Canada. So I'm like, man, I'm going to sit next to this Jamaican guy. What are we going to talk about? I'll tell you what, we have a lot in common. Like men, wherever we live in the world, we have the same problems. Whether you got problems at home with your wife or, you're stressed about your kids or your work or whatever it might be. I quickly realized, and it was such a great exercise of just, like you said, throw yourself into it. Allow yourself to enjoy it, be open-minded, and people will love speaking to you as well and learning about the Canadian culture or whatever you bring to the table. So it's been my experience as well. And I promote it as well to people.
So break down for us a little bit about the demographics, the sociographics, some of the cultural things. How many people? Where describe the island to us so we have a better understanding.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating. I always say to people, it's a very unique place because yes, it is. First of all, it's in the middle of nowhere. So when you fly to Cayman, you literally fly from Miami over Cuba, and then it's just open water for quite a while, and then all of a sudden there's this beautiful island, like gorgeous beaches, clear water around it. And so it's really off on its own. Whereas in the Eastern Caribbean, you have like series of islands, one after the other. That's not the case with Cayman. It's very isolated. I think that isolation also makes it very unique in the way that news doesn't travel as fast to the Cayman Islands, stress doesn't travel as quickly to the Cayman Islands. So it has that relaxed, Caribbean vibe about it. It's retained that, even though it's like a world famous financial center, and it has been now for a number of decades. Um, it attracts the A-type personality, I would say. You do have a lot of lawyers and accountants on island because they're working for the big firms. So it attracts a certain type of person, but it also attracts a ton of entrepreneurs. They have a very successful program, inward investment program through the Cayman Enterprise City, which is designed to bring in foreign businesses, set up shop, head offices in Cayman. That brings in a lot of really interesting, people in the crypto space, people, digital assets in general, a lot of programming, computer software, stuff like that. And so, yeah, you get to meet people from all over the world. They're generally pretty smart. They're interesting, and they're there to make money. They're not paying taxes. So they're benefiting from this like generous, tax structure basically that the Cayman Islands has adopted, where they make money from fees instead of taxation, income tax. So they'll tax you on, for example, my work permit, for example, will cost, a few, $10,000-$20,000 a year, but I won't pay any taxes from my earnings. So anyways, very unique. Haven't been to another place like it quite yet. And I would encourage any young person, like if you're in your early 20s and you're like, I don't know what to do, go to the Cayman Islands. They're looking for people. They want to hire people, and you'll work your way up, the ladder as you go.
What about the topography, the number of islands? Talk to us a little bit about the landmass.
That's the part that's probably a little bit less flattering. It's a very flat island. I think the highest point is like 50 feet above sea level. So if you're looking for beautiful mountains and waterfalls and caves, and they do have some caves, underground caves, but it is not the most flattering. It's not like going to Hawaii or St. Kitts even or anything like that. And there are three islands. There are two sister islands, which I love. The Brac has about 2,000 people. It's kind of like going back, what the Caribbean was in the 1980s or something, where you'll walk down the middle of the highway, you might see one car pass you, kind of thing. It's pretty sleepy. And then there's Little Cayman. So if that's too much for you, go to Little Cayman. Little Cayman has about 200 people, and that's like a diving paradise. A little bit more topography in the Brac and Little Cayman, and known for diving and people that are looking to really detach from the world. But there's not a whole lot of business activity happening in either of those places.
And then Grand Cayman, how many are in Grand Cayman now?
Yeah, Grand Cayman's got so the population I think right now is about 70,000 residents full time, but it feels a lot more because you've got, I'd say, depending on the season, you've probably got anywhere between 30 to 50,000 tourists that are staying there. You've got some transient workers like myself who come in and out of the island to do work and business. So it feels really busy. It's pretty small, in terms of, for us Canadians, I think it's about 30 kilometers in length, so about 20 miles in length. So that's it's quick. You can drive around the island in like 4 hours. But it's one of those places people are like, oh, you must get bored. You're like, I never got bored. There's so much to do in terms not only of your business activities, your socializing, obviously, but sports, clubs, if you're into theater, if you're in like whatever your hobby is, someone else is doing it in Cayman. And because there's a fair amount of money and wealth, like they do it well. It's like boating is really big there. But anything you're into, the music scene, for example, is really healthy as well. The art scene is really healthy as well. So yeah, it's a pretty cool spot. And in terms of the mix of people, what you're going to find of those 70,000 residents, you're going to get about 35,000 Caymanians, so born and raised Caymanians, and about the same amount of expats. So you've got a really cool balance between the two. And generally speaking, like we were talking about earlier, everyone pretty much gets along. Like you don't you don't see arguments, you don't see, any kind of racism or anything like that. I've never experienced it in my time there.
Fantastic. So there's many offshore jurisdictions. There's many quote unquote tax haven jurisdictions. Some are really excellent and some are really crummy. Cayman is known as like the premier offshore jurisdiction. That's where people go with a lot of money. My guess is that there are certain laws in place that really help foster this type of thing. Talk to us about the laws and why Cayman is so attractive.
So based on British common law as a foundation, another thing that makes it very attractive is that it's a fairly young country. So the amount of case law and precedents in Cayman is actually very, I wouldn't say very limited. That's probably the wrong way of describing it. And I'm by no means an attorney, but you don't have, hundreds and hundreds of years of kind of case law or precedents that can affect judgments in the current, environment. So I'd say they're a little bit more agile in terms of the way that they can navigate the legal system in Cayman. You do have some excellent attorneys because it's such a nice place to live. You attract some very talented attorneys who eventually can become judges as well. You'll see there, but so you're talking about the same legal system in general as the United Kingdom, similar to what you'd experience in other significant offshore jurisdictions like Singapore has a very similar base law, system. But I think really what makes it probably more attractive than the laws, like the property. So you have the privacy laws, which are some of the best in the world. So requests for information, for example, like if you look at it, the United States would probably be on the other end of that threshold where access to information, like literally you can go online and find just ridiculous amounts of information on people who live in the United States, whether it be criminal records, whether it be, their financials in some cases. It's all out there. You might have to pay for it, but you can get that information. I know because we pay to get it to scrub our clients. So I know that we can see a lot. But when you fall into places like Cayman, the United Kingdom, there's a lot more emphasis on the protection of data and privacy. And so there are a lot of laws written around that. That includes obviously finances in some cases, not money that's in the bank necessarily. But when it comes to companies like SWP, we don't have to share any of that information with either local or foreign jurisdictions. And then if you couple that, so privacy, if you couple that with the tax system and tax law in Cayman, and the way that they manage themselves, I think it's very, very, from a corporate standpoint, it's very, very attractive as well. So you'll see a lot of corporations setting up in Cayman. Yeah.
Is Cayman CRS compliant?
Cayman is, yes, I believe they are. And again, I'm not an expert on the matter, but I'm not a compliance expert, but Cayman has made huge leaps and bounds over the last 20 years because they initially made their reputation because they were a little bit loose and fast, and that's truth be told. And I think, maybe you could say the same thing about Panama. You can tell me, but historically, it was a little bit loose and fast. And there were stories of people in the 80s showing up with duffel bags full of cash, going to banks, no questions asked. It's in the system. What they realized in the 80s, particularly through the 90s, transitioning, was if we want to remain a legitimate leader in financial services, we need to be fully compliant. And up until 2022, they actually were still on the European Union's gray list. And some people would argue that was more political. That was the European Union penalizing the United Kingdom for leaving during Brexit. And they threw Cayman back on the list and made it difficult for Cayman. But what it forced them to do is just be even more compliant. And so what you see basically now is that in terms of the banking system, in terms of other financial services companies in Cayman, they're extremely compliant, more so than you would find in the Bahamas, for example, or even more so than you could argue than some American banks might be. So extremely compliant. It doesn't affect us, thank God, because compliance is not always a good thing, in my opinion. There's too much of it, I think, these days.
Agreed. 100%
but yeah,
agreed.
Generally speaking, the jurisdiction itself puts a high value on compliance at this point in time. Yeah.
Well, I would say that the other reason is because you guys are not listed. Well, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys aren't listed as a financial institution because you're not a bank. So you're
That's right.
custodians and a logistics company, correct?
That's right. Well, we have two licenses. First business license is a retailer of precious metals, which puts us in the same. We are regulated. There's a department of the government called the Department of Commerce and Investment. So we're fully regulated. We fall under the same guidelines as real estate, law offices, and dealers of precious stones, which would be like a jewelry company, for example, like
Sure.
a Burks or something like that. So yeah, we are regulated in that sense, but we're not a financial institution. And there's a pretty major gap in terms of not necessarily the requirements, but the amount of data sharing that goes on when you're a fully licensed and regulated financial institution. You're in for, if you were a client of ours in that case, I could not sit here and tell you that you'd be like, hey, do they have access to my banking information or my account values? And I couldn't sit here with a straight face and tell you that they didn't if I were a bank. But in SWP's case, I'm happy to say that we don't share information with anybody. We've never had to, except if it's requested through the Grand Courts of Cayman, which is a legal process. And it's only happened twice to us in the last 10 years where two clients, there was a request for information, and both those guys turned out to be, or it was one woman and one guy, they turned out to be pretty bad people. And we were glad not only to share the information with the courts, we're also happy to fire them as clients once we knew what they had gotten up to. So, yeah.
Sure. Well, this is exactly the point that I'm getting in. I'm kind of lining things up here. When you guys store precious metals, if you're storing them with a bank, there's certain disclosure agreements because they are financial institutions. There's things called FATCA, this is the US Dragnet. There's CRS, which is the rest of the world's Dragnet. It's an automatic exchange of information and a disclosure of your identity and information back to your home country governments. This is for financial institutions. If you're working with a private vault, in most cases, and if done correctly, there's no exchanging of this type of information because they're just custodians. They're just working there as security to protect what's yours. So think about this when looking at international vault storage. Is it a bank? Is it a private institution? What are the laws in place of the jurisdiction? There's a lot that goes into choosing these types of institutions.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And based on I've visited many vaults in my day, obviously as part of my work. I believe I don't want to say it's international because I can't speak to every single jurisdiction where a vault is located, but most private facilities like SWP and even some larger operators, and you talk about the Brinks or the Loomises of the world, I don't believe they're sharing any client information at all as well. So it's definitely a benefit that people need to look into. And just to finish the point, I forgot to mention the second business license that we have is exactly that, is secure storage, basically, which puts us in the same group as any storage facility that offers custodian services.
Now, do you have a separate license for the logistics from the moving of metals, or does that fall under another? Because I know that you are able to transport if someone has metals in the US and they want to re-domicile those metals to the Caymans, you can actually help facilitate that.
Yeah, that doesn't require a separate license on our part. That falls under our secure storage license. Basically, the ability to move metal to or from the Cayman Islands or to or from any of the vaults that we offer, because there's 11 of them now. It's starting to become a pretty long list. It's just basically an auxiliary service to facilitate the core business of secure storage. So don't require a separate license for that, but you're absolutely right. We move a lot of metal around the world. We've gotten really good at it. We have a great logistics team that's, is familiar with customs law and documentation, and we handle all that because trust me, like you and I, well, not you and I necessarily, but if you're a retail investor in precious metals, you've got some gold, say up in Canada or in Panama, and you're like, I want to move it to another country. That's an undertaking you probably don't want to take on your own. It's hours of research and you might get it wrong. And if you do, it might get stuck somewhere. And that's the last thing you probably want. So definitely good to hire a company that's proficient in that area.
I've been working with precious metals for well over a decade now. I've visited probably at least a dozen vaults around the world, in the Middle East, in Singapore, and Germany, and Austria, Switzerland, down here in Panama, of course, lots of places all over the world, and help a lot of my private clients with the moving of the metals and the logistics of these. And absolutely, I can attest that working with a competent partner on this is extremely important, especially when you take into play the import taxes and the duties and the different things like this, what has to be declared and in what circumstances, and the source of the metals and how it was purchased. And there is a lot of moving pieces in something like this.
Yeah, and it's only gotten more complicated since COVID. The two events should not correlate at all when you think about I'm not going to get into COVID, but whatever you call that, and the importation of goods through customs and border controls. You would not expect those two things to correlate, but I can tell you it became a lot more challenging, and there's a lot more regulation and oversight at borders today than there was 4 years ago. And so it was already challenging enough to begin with. And now I would advise against it completely. If you're a private person and you're like, oh, I think I can make this work, like you're probably going to screw it up, or you're going to run into a customs agent who's going to screw it up on your behalf, and your stuff's going to get stuck there, and then you're not going to know what to do. So a lot of reasons, like you said, to hire professionals for this type of work.
100%. Now, also for the listeners, just so you guys understand, a lot of cases, it's going to be dependent on when you purchase your precious metals. Because if you're looking at something that you bought gold when it was $300 an ounce and you want to move it overseas, you're definitely going to be better for working with the logistics and paying the transport and things like that. But let's say that you bought gold last week, you might want to just sell the metals and repurchase them, because we're not talking about large capital appreciation. Because you have to think if this is going to be a taxable event or a non-taxable event, and then it comes down to your individual situation or your family's situation and what your tax obligations are to your home country or the country that you're a resident of. So once again, there's a lot of moving pieces in the strategy of how you are going to re-domicile these metals.
Very good point. Another on that point of planning, for Americans who would be listening, they may want to consider owning precious metals in an IRA. There can be some tax advantages there. The Roth IRA can be particularly attractive, but also worth checking out the traditional. We do facilitate IRA transactions as well. So even though we're an offshore company, we work with U.S. custodians, or I should say, U.S. administrators, IRA administrators that allow their clients to store precious metals in Cayman, or we can also store them in Texas and Delaware, which are two of the other facilities that we offer our clients. So that's something to consider. And for Canadians, you've got the RSPs, you've got the TFSAs, you can include gold and silver from the Royal Canadian Mint in both of those. So other things to consider if you're making gold and silver a part of your long-term strategy. Those are some areas to consider from a taxation standpoint.
Well, with an RRSP, are the metals physically held in the Cayman, or are they physically held in Canada?
No, with the Canadian government is a little bit more stringent. It has to be Royal Canadian Mint product, and it has to be stored in an approved facility, which basically boils down to, I think there's 2 or 3 vaults in Mississauga, where actually, no, that's not true. Calgary also has
Calgary,
one.
Right?
Yeah, Calgary also has one. So we don't do it starts getting convoluted. We don't actually do the storage in Canada for RSPs, but Brinks is an approved storage provider. We can sell the metal. We can't store it in Canada. So a little bit convoluted on that end, but again, doesn't stop people from checking out. Questrade would be the broker that they can use to buy the metal, to transact with. They actually buy the metal from us, but yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm not a Canadian lawyer by any stretch of the imagination, but I know Canadian retirement accounts pretty well, I would say, and I advise a lot of clients and help them with these types of things along with the lawyers. And I know it gets very tricky with the retirement accounts and doing international investments, where a US for a self-directed IRA is amazing. Like, I mean, what you can do with that and how flexible they are in where you're putting your money is a very nice thing to see. And I don't say that very much out of any government program ever. So
I agree with that.
So before we get into the vaulting itself, I wanted to actually go backwards, because to talk a little bit about our point on why Cayman is Cayman, I would say my guess or my hunch is it actually comes out a lot down to the immigration in the country. Now, they're quite stringent with their immigration and who they give work permits to and how you can enter into the country. Maybe you can give us the 101 on immigration. I understand, of course, you're not an immigration attorney, but just the really basics so people kind of understand the difference between this and other countries.
Yeah. So again, yeah, not an expert, but have been around enough and have heard enough stories told by. Obviously, I've gone through the process myself. I have been a full-time resident. I've been a work permit holder. So start with the work permits. That's probably the most common way that an expat would end up in the Cayman Islands. Like I hinted earlier, talking about young people, but this applies to people in our age group. It applies, to anyone who's working. Cayman has a net shortage of employees. So, the 35,000 Caymanians in that economy, they can't fill all the jobs. And in some cases, they don't want to. There's some jobs that are not attractive. Caymanians typically are attracted towards banking jobs. They're typically attracted towards, reinsurance. They're attracted towards government jobs. They're attracted towards jobs that pay well. And of course, they should be. They live there. They're born there. Like, take the best jobs. That leaves a lot of vacancy. And so that's where you start seeing Canadians, Brits, Jamaicans, everybody, from all over the world are filling these jobs. So most people end up on a work permit. It's not that difficult to obtain one. That's the point I'm getting at. So if you just look for job postings in your field in Cayman, chances are you'll see them or work with a recruiting agency. And you can more than likely find yourself a sponsor who will help you, because you do need to sponsor a business basically to sponsor you and file the application on your behalf, basically saying, I need this employee to do this job, for a period of 2 years or whatever. And you end up with a work permit. Yeah.
Okay, but the majority of my listeners are business owners, investors, high net worth families, things like this. They're not going to go apply for a job at Chick-a-Flick or something like this and, do hospitality, right? These people are coming in with large sums of money. Let's talk a little bit about the investor's visa, because I believe it is one of the most expensive investor's visas on planet Earth. Yeah,
it is. It is. And it's gone up in price. Even in the 10 years that I've been interacting with Cayman, it's gone up in price significantly. So I think there's that option. And I don't know what the threshold is right now in terms of a business owner looking to make an investment through that particular program outside of the special economic zone. Because I want to come back to the CEC, the special economic zone. I'm not here to promote them, but I have found from experience, and we own a company in the zone, I can speak to that. But in terms of the investment for status, there is a program where you can invest and start a business. There's a program obviously where you can invest or you have enough means to support yourself where you don't have to be working. So people who are retiring, for example, they can purchase property, which will, if at a certain level or a certain level of investment is made, they can just go retire there. And I think that threshold is somewhere around $2 million right now, but I could be wrong. In terms of the investment for business, I don't know what the threshold is. You definitely want to check that out. But for people, let's say, who aren't yet millionaires, but want to relocate and want to take their work with them, their own work, not someone else's job at the Chick-fil-A, you can go through a special economic zone like the Cayman Enterprise City. So let's say you had a startup, 1 or 2 employees. You can obtain a permit for your company, work permit, which is good for 5 years, which is awesome because most work permits in Cayman are 2 years. So if you can land yourself a 5-year permit and a business permit and even an office for I want to say about 15 to 20,000 US, that's pretty sweet. And, that's affordable for a lot of people. So that is a program that has had a lot of success. I think there's about 500 companies that have relocated to Cayman in the last 5 years through that program. And they actually have a full campus. So you can actually be part of a community. You can go to work every day and work with other people that are like-minded and so on and so forth. So yeah, special economic zone, Cayman Enterprise City, definitely worth checking out for your listeners.
Amazing. Well, we love the special economic zones, and I do a lot of work with Tipolis, with Alex Voss and Titus Gable and stuff like that in free private cities. And we're constantly looking into new special economic zones and what benefits those add. So I'm a big fan of a lot of those type of works and the different programs. So actually, I think when I come to visit you next year, which we've said we're already going to make happen, I want to go and take a look at that for sure.
Definitely. That's a great idea. Yeah.
Absolutely. Also, with the residency permit, I want people to understand that Cayman is one of the more difficult countries to do naturalization and to actually get citizenship there. So a lot of the work permits might be for 25 years. Like you can reside there, but your chances of actually going through a naturalization can be very, very difficult. What I'm getting at is that they really want to control who is on the island. And it's almost like when I lived in the UAE. You can be a resident there, you can live there for 5 years, 10 years. Like I was there for almost 10 years. I would never become a citizen there. It's just not possible for me. And if I did something that they didn't like or I was not an attractive person to them anymore, they can just cancel my work permit and I would have to leave. So I think that because Cayman has been very stringent on the immigration, they've really been able to curate the type of people that they want on the island, which has made it a really more exclusive type of jurisdiction because it's harder to get into.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And in Cayman, the way that it works during your 8th year, you basically have a pretty big decision. So you can stay there up to 8 years, and then you have a decision to make. You're going to either apply for PR, so become a permanent resident, which doesn't give you voting rights. You're not naturalized, but it does allow you, if you are successful, then you can stay on the island for as long as you want. And you can eventually apply to be naturalized, or you can just remain a PR holder. So that decision after 8 years has to be made. If you don't apply or you're unsuccessful in your application, and it's based on a point system ranging from property ownership to community service and knowledge of history of the Cayman Islands. So far, there's a whole point system involved. If you don't do it or you're unsuccessful, you have to leave for 1 year and then you can return. But I would say, if you've been there 8 years, chances are you love it. And you're going to try to make it your home. And if you're smart about it, let's say after year 2, year 3, when you decide, okay, this is going to be a place I want to raise a family or I'm going to have a business, then you're going to start accumulating property and knowledge and all these community service. You're going to do these things. I mean, it's just natural. And that's what they're looking for. They're looking for people that are not only going to give back financially, also going to give back to the community and the well-being of the island.
Yeah, and to put things in context, here in Panama, I'm getting people permanent residency in 1 month. So in Cayman, it's 8 years before you have the option of even applying for your permanent residency. In other countries, it's very fast. So it's a different type of ball game when you're talking about Cayman. But it's good because I think that all countries should be different and they should appeal to different sets of the population and try to do different things. And Cayman has found its way in something that it's really good at, and it has a phenomenal reputation because of this. So I think it's a really interesting place. Kind of for my work, it is a certain tool in the toolbox. It doesn't fit everybody's situation or what they're trying to accomplish, but for the right person, it fits extremely well.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and definitely part of their success. It can be frustrating for certain people who may not qualify for PR. But again, from my experience and friends, Canadians, speaking largely of Canadian expats, but I've met people from all over the world that have been successful. It is completely possible if you put in the work and then really that's your ultimate goal to do it. And like you said, it just creates a good and long-term environment. And the island is small. It's like Panama, you've got like landmass, right? You got space. Cayman doesn't have that space. It's if they just handed out PR permits, how many Americans would show up knocking, buying property on the beach, and just like it would be South Florida, right? So they've had to control it, and they've done a good job of controlling it as well. Yeah.
Amazing. So talk to us a little bit about your facility, because I understand somewhat recently you guys moved to a new location, and I've seen some of the videos and the pictures, and it looks phenomenal.
Yeah, we're proud of the new location. So we started the journey, like I said, in 2015. I'll never forget the day we took our first deposit of precious metals. This poor guy, he's still a client to this day, which is awesome. He came off a cruise ship with 500 silver eagles in a monster box, if you know, like one of those green boxes with 500 silver eagles. So we have lunch together, and then it's time for me to take him to the vault. And literally, he walks into the vault, and there's nothing in there. It's empty shelves. At the time it was a nice new facility, not the one we're in today. But anyways, long story short, the guy deposited. I always remember. So 2015, he puts in 500 silver eagles. Fast forward 7 years, we're running out of space. We don't have enough space in the vault. We need to build a new facility. So we went, not only did we build a new facility, we bought the land. So the landowners were the facility owners. We have full control over everything happening in the building. Whereas in the old space, we were renting, we didn't have as much control. And so we tripled our storage size from the previous facility, the original facility. It was completed in October of 2023, so it's brand new. It's category 5 hurricane rated, which is standard in Cayman now, but this is like on steroids. This thing is over-engineered, like 200% over-engineered. So in the amount of rebar involved, the thickness of the walls, the foundation, the roofing, everything, it's like, it's a bunker. It'll be there in 1,000 years. That's what I tell people. This building will still be standing no matter where the world is at in 1,000 years. And inside the facility itself, obviously you have all the bells and whistles from modern day security systems, man traps, everything that you would see in a standard vault. You've got 2 large class 3 vaults. Class 3 is the highest rating that a vault can have in North America.
UL3
systems. UL3, yeah. So UL3 rated. You've got, interior loading bays. So like when metals arrive, everything is done inside the building. There's never any exposure to the outside world. You have exterior fencing that prevents any unexpected visitors to the facility. So everything is done by appointment. So if you or I showed up unannounced to the building tomorrow, we would not be allowed to get past that front gate, and then different layers of security throughout the building, basically, that are all wrapped around what's most important, what people often forget, but why we do all these things. It's great to have good security. It's great to have a good building. It's great to be in a good jurisdiction. You do it for insurance. You want the best insurance policy possible. And we basically went to the insurer before we started the project and said, here's our blueprint. This is what we're thinking. Tell us if we can improve anywhere. And that's what they did. And we kind of built the building around the insurance, which is for the client. At the end of the day, that's what they should care about. Does the facility have a good insurance policy? And in case something happens to my metals, which is actually extremely rare and unlikely because vaults are too difficult to hit for criminals. It's just too much to deal with. And metal is so heavy that logistically it's a pain in the ass. Trust me, we had to move all the stuff from the old facility.
But why, by the way, really when you guys see people running down the street with a briefcase filled with gold in a Hollywood movie, they're completely full of shit. This is non-existent. I have picked up like bars of gold that were physically, like, dimension-wise not that big, but weighed so much. It is unbelievably dense. Like you can hold $500,000 in your hand, and it's just this little bar. It's crazy how heavy they are.
Yeah, that 30-pound bar that you're referencing, the 400-ounce bar, feels like 50 pounds. And then if you multiply, it becomes a question of how much can they get away with. So yes, this is all factored into the insurance discussion. But what we've always decided is to insure for every dollar of value that's in the facility. We do have some large clients that hold their own policies, so we don't have to insure them. But majority of our clients, like 95% of them, fall under our universal insurance policy, and it's pretty much bulletproof. It insures against hurricanes, it insures against internal theft, it insures against fire, it insures against all the things that you can prevent. Yeah.
Now, let me ask you, are you insuring against the replacement value, or are you insuring against spot?
We insure against, so it's a very good question, and it's a nuanced question, but most insurance companies, so the underwriters, Lloyd's, they insure against the London fixed value on the day that the loss is recorded, or sorry, that is brought forward to their attention. So basically what that means is we don't insure replacement value. We insure based on a spot value or the London fixed value on that particular day. But in our storage agreement, we reserve the right to replace. So we can either pay cash or we can reserve the right to replace the bar coin at our cost. Essentially, we would pay the premium for the bar coin. We've never had to do it, but I could tell you if it did happen, we would probably replace, because it means we get to retain the client. Hopefully they still want to do business with us. We retain the client though, and we retain the storage billings that are involved with providing the service. So it's in our best interest actually to replace the bars and coins.
Okay, another slightly nuanced question. what is your insurance on the overnight?
What is our
So
insurance
let's
on the overnight?
so let's
What?
say,
Sorry,
for
no one's ever
example,
asked me
gold.
that before.
Okay, let's say that example is that gold is $2,400 at end of day 5 p.m. Okay. And something happens at 1 a.m. and gold skyrockets 20%. Okay.
Okay.
And skyrockets 10%. Okay. And at that same time, the vault gets hit. Are they replacing per the 100% insurance as per the close of the business day, or is it up? Like, how often is it updated? Because
Oh,
what
okay.
we want to
I
see
understand.
is that
Yeah.
you actually have some type of a buffer in place, that if something happened and there was a surge in the price of precious metals, that it would actually be covered for that.
Yeah. So we can ask for it is nuanced, and people need to understand that updating your insurance policy is not as easy as picking up the phone. It's a pretty lengthy process, actually. When you renew, even when
100%.
you renew, like we've been doing this for 10 years, and every October 1st, let's call it, we have to renew our insurance policy. That process starts around May or June, because the guys at Lloyd's of London, bless their hearts, they're not a fast moving bunch. Like there's a big queue of business coming every day, I'm sure, to Lloyd's. And not only that, is they are very detail oriented. So they want to know, has anything changed at the facility, any losses during the year, any new threats to Cayman? Like they do a whole review of all the risks and threats, and then they review the figures, they present you with the quotes, so on and so forth. So when you want to make an adjustment, say, hey, I need an extra $25 million on my insurance policy, it's not like just picking up the phone or firing off an email. In theory. So what they do, because they know you need those buffers, so the way that they handle it is they say, okay, at the beginning of the year, you have a base premium or a base policy, let's call it $700 million. How much buffer do you think you're going to need? And then what we do is we'll say we think we need a $200 million buffer this year. So okay, we're not going to charge you for that unless you use it, which is nice of them. And then so we can call in an adjustment or make a request, and it's a request in writing. It doesn't happen immediately. It takes like 2 or 3 days to be recognized by them. But you can basically call that in, and as long as it's within your buffer, they don't review anything. Like, hey, you're good, and you end up paying the additional premium at the end of the year. So in a scenario like that, if gold went up 10%, yes, tomorrow I would write an email to Lloyd's or to my broker to ask them to increase it as much as I possibly can. But I can also increase the value of the total value every 3 months. So there's also a schedule for asking for more buffer for more base policy, effectively. Okay. Yeah, so a little bit nuanced.
Good answer.
The insurance world is not, it's an honest answer. It's not as fast moving. So you just got to plan ahead. But keep in mind, when you read an insurance policy, what it says is let's say 700 million is the policy. They'll say 700 million per loss. So long as the loss that you're reporting is $1 less or equal, you're good. So you always go back to that thing you mentioned earlier about the guys throwing the stuff and it's like, how much can they get? Like, good luck. How much can you get in that 30-minute window that you might have achieved to do a robbery, which is already extremely difficult, So yeah.
Well, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think like a UL1 is with a commercial tools that are available. It will take you 30 minutes to enter in basically a small hole into the side of the wall. Yeah. So a small hole, that's 30 minutes for a UL1. Then for a UL2, you double it. So it now becomes 60 minutes. And for a UL3, you double the time on a UL2. So now you're talking 2 hours minimum to get in to put a hole. A hole. That doesn't mean a man-sized hole. That means a small hole to be able to enter in. Now I'm sure I'll get some people in the comments, well, what about thermal lances and all of this? That's not commercially available. You need to have special licenses to get those types of things. Those types of pieces of equipment are completely tracked. They know where they are. That's a different type of ball game. Not saying that some sophisticated crime organization couldn't get them, but that's kind of outside of the scope of normal conversation of what people are commercially able to get to. But people don't realize, like, when they think, oh, you could break into this vault or just cut into it. It's like, no, this takes hours upon hours upon
Oh,
hours.
yeah.
And, we can talk about the physical security of the vault itself, but then we also can talk about, all right, the police department, or the on-site security, or people with guns who are going to be close by. They're not just going to allow you to just drill into this for hours on end. Like, there's seismic, there's even pieces of tungsten, I would imagine, in your concrete walls. So if you're trying to drill into this, it's going to shatter the bit. Like, these things get very, very complicated. After I've toured so many different vaults and gone through the security, it's like, nobody's getting in this. This is not
Yeah,
Hollywood movies.
you've got seismic sensors throughout the facility. Basically, floor and roof are wired. It's not a Hollywood movie, and it's certainly not a Hollywood movie. But even if you managed to get through, and we're not talking a hole like this, you're going to need like a body-sized hole, or you're going to have to get through the vault door. And I asked a locksmith once, a professional locksmith. He was doing some maintenance on the vault door, which is a class 3 door. It's like 2 feet thick. And I'm like, and it's interesting how they work. If you've ever looked inside a vault door, like there's a plane of glass behind there, and if they penetrate the door with a drill, the glass shatters, all the mechanism sees, the door becomes like completely useless. Like it doesn't open, it won't open, it won't unlock. You can't open it. Now you have to go through the door. So I'm like, I asked this professional, I'm like, how long, if you had all the tools and you could sit here and just crack this door, how long would it take you? He goes, 3 days. That's a professional locksmith. So imagine, a professional criminal is probably, if this guy's 3 days, maybe the best in the world, a couple hours. But in the meantime, you have security, you have the alarm systems, you have the sensors. But again, Cayman has one of the best, and it's all insured. So it doesn't even matter. You know what? Go ahead, knock yourself out, guys. It's insured. But we have one of the best defense systems in the world. Is a massive moat surrounding us. So you have to now get off the island. You've got air traffic control. You've got Coast Guard. I mean, it is a movie. If you pulled it off, it would be an epic movie. I'd watch it for sure.
Yeah. And I'm guessing that these are 6-sided vaults as well, right? So it's not even like in the movies where they just dig through the floor. It's like, these are 6-sided vaults. You're not getting into that thing from up above, or from digging through the floor or anything like that.
And the floor or the ground, the earth in Cayman is basically volcanic rock. So there's about this much topsoil. There's like a few inches of topsoil, and then it's like rock. So you can't, like, it's not like in Canada where you actually have some soil you can dig into and under. It's like you're trying to dig through volcanic rock. Like, good luck with that mission. It's not feasible. That's why they don't have basements in Cayman. No one has a basement. Can't do it. Yeah.
Sure, makes sense. Okay, talk to us a little bit about 100% allocated, 100% segregated. So, two very, very important phrases, I would say.
Super important. It's probably like, let's put aside our fantasies of criminality for a second and talk about like property ownership, because this is critical, and this is where things go wrong for people. This is where things go wrong for investors, is when they don't understand what they actually own, or do they even own it in the first place. So, and it does get a little bit nuanced. I'm going to try to keep it simple, but people tend to make a decision about the type of ownership and custody service that they use or pay for based on price. So they're like, I want to save 0.5%. So I'm going to choose an unallocated product, or I'm going to buy an unallocated or unsegregated product. So unallocated, unsegregated is the worst. If it's got 2 ones in front of it, it's bad. It's cheap, but it's bad. So basically it means you don't own a specific bar or coin. And because you don't, it's unallocated. So it's not even, there isn't even a physical allocation behind it. It could be a futures contract. It could be scrap material that's somewhere between the Royal Canadian Mint and some jeweler that sent it there. It could be anything. It's numbers on paper. It's a position that exists, but there's no physical metal allocated to that position. Unsegregated, meaning that you and I could be co-owners of the same big bar of gold or silver. It's unsegregated to us. It is a pooled product, essentially. So when you have both of those things combined, you have nothing. When you have allocated and segregated, it means that it is allocated to bars and coins, but you and I could be co-owners, like I just touched on. And then you have the fully allocated, fully segregated version, which is each ounce of metal is fully allocated to a specific bar or coin, and it's fully segregated. Ownership is what it means to the person who owns it. So your stuff is segregated from my stuff. They might sit next to each other or near each other on the shelf. In our case, we use bins to divide it, but I've seen other vaults where you and I can be on the same shelf or general area, but there is segregation of your coins and bars versus my coins and bars. And that's really important because gold and silver is considered personal property under the law. It's like you're the proprietor of that very expensive watch or of that very expensive vehicle. You're the proprietor of that gold and silver. So that means that you have a lot of rights that come with that. So if someone challenges your personal property, or there's a bankruptcy in the vault and there's a challenge on who owns that asset because there's a bankruptcy claim in effect, it's really easy for it to say it's his. It's not the company's, it's his. And that's where things go wrong, because when companies do stupid stuff, either they end up going bankrupt or there ends up being corruption or fraud within the company and the police get involved or the government gets involved, even worse. And I've seen cases where the government tries to seize assets belonging to a company before. You want to make sure that your ownership is very, very clear. And that's why fully segregated and fully allocated is very, very important. So I'm glad you asked that question. I'm very passionate about it. And a lot of people try to save themselves money, but they don't know what they're doing. They just don't know what they're doing.
Very well put, and I definitely agree with you. A couple of ways that I try to explain it to clients is, let's say that you put in a bar and that bar has a serial number, and you come back tomorrow, a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, 10 years from now, 500 years from now. It should be the exact same bar, the exact same serial number. It's not a bar that looks like it or one that is kind of similar or something like that. It's the exact same one. This is super important. And as to your second point, basically what you're describing is the assets are not appearing on your balance sheet. So creditors can't come after you if you mismanage the business, or you don't pay your rent or your taxes, or you overspend, or your employee fees, or your employment contracts with your team is too expensive and you can't afford these things. You can't now just dip into the funds, or creditors can't come after the precious metals, because you are not the owner of it. You are only a custodian of the ownership of it, of the precious metals. That is a big difference, especially when we start analyzing contractual law and really understanding, as once again we've mentioned, the nuances of these types of things. Whatever vault you guys decide to work with, please, for the love of God, make sure it is 100% allocated, 100% segregated, 100% insured. These are the three magic phrases that you need to look for. If you don't find them, run. Okay, run.
You nailed it. I mean, those are the three things that I always tell my clients as well. And, I'm just going to throw this out there for the sake of conversation. Maybe you're going there, maybe we weren't. People always ask me about ETFs. And they're like, gold ETFs are great, super cheap, super, functional, fast, easy. I'm like, you're right. I use them as well. If I think gold's going to go up in the next 30 days, I might buy an ETF because I want to get in and out of the market as quick and as cheaply as possible. But if you're using a gold ETF as a long-term method to own a gold position, you need to read the contract, and it's really long. And I read it. Yeah, I was bored. I was on a really long flight, and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to get to the bottom of this ETF question. So I read the agreement, and it was for one of the biggest ETFs in North America. It's like very well-known brand name. I'm not going to throw it out there, but people would have heard of it. And I get into the
I could probably guess which one it was, but if you don't want to say it, then I won't say it either. But
it would be on your top three, definitely. So, we're talking billions and billions of dollars of precious metals in this thing. So I'm like, I get to the crux of it when it talks about the custody of the assets and who's responsible. So first of all, the company selling ETF, not responsible. That gets passed off to a financial institution. Another big name. This one I'll throw out there, HSBC. HSBC is the custodian of the physical metal backing the ETF. I'm like, two things. I've been inside an HSBC vault before to do an audit when I was a younger man in the industry. Not a good scene. Not a good scene. Very disorganized. They ended up declaring tons of losses when they closed this particular vault because they hadn't had the proper controls in place and there was a shortage of metal, and all the companies that had stored metal there, some of them had to go after them. So it's all public. So that's not a secret. People had to go after HSBC for losses in that case. But the second thing that I would like to point out here is imagine handing billions of dollars to a bank and expecting, to your point, that the same bar with the same serial number is going to be there in 5 weeks, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I can guarantee you that won't be the case because banks love leverage. They love leveraging assets. And it's written into their contracts that they have the ability, generally speaking, to do that. So when I read this contract for the ETF, I'm like, would I put $1 million of my gold in a vault over at HSBC? I'm like, oh, fuck no. There's no way I would do that. And I would never advise anyone who's holding precious metals long-term to do that unless they understand the risk. And that risk is worth the money that they think they're saving.
Well, I think it always comes down to what are the goals and what are the objectives. This is the first thing that I tell every single private client that I work with. What we're trying to figure out is what are your goals and what are your objectives. If the goal and the objective is to speculate on the movement of the physical underlying metal, then an ETF is great if that's what you're trying to do. For most of my private clients, what we're trying to do is retain value, retain worth, retain purchasing power. So we're looking for something that can't be inflated away, money printers go burr type of situation. All right. And for that, you need to own the underlying asset. You can't use foldable like paper gold or these type of gold-like products, quote unquote. You need to have the actual metal. And that is something that you can actually use as a bedrock for a portfolio that you can pass on to your heirs and to your grandkids and everything like this. I think that is super, super important. But once again, what are the goals and what are the objectives?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. You always have to start there. And that's very true. And in physical bullion, I mean, it does have, as great as it is in terms of property ownership, hedging against inflation long term, it's a fantastic financial product in certain scenarios, but it may not be for everybody. People, that are looking for to save $1 or are uncomfortable paying premiums to attain a physical commodity aren't going to be comfortable with physical bullion. And we get that. And a lot of people, unfortunately, the majority of people don't own any, which is somewhat shocking. But because I know, and you know from firsthand, from my own personal experience, forget business, it's done good things for my family. It's done good things for my long-term, financial situation. And not because I'm a savvy investor. It's actually the opposite because it's really simple and it works. Given enough time, it's like property ownership. It's like given enough time, precious metals always does its job. And that's why it's an amazing product because it's so predictable and boring. And it's like, if your time horizon is anything more than like 2 or 3 years, having some physical metal in your ownership, it's only going to help you in the long run because it's going to hedge you against all kinds of risks, especially inflation. And it was, had a great conversation with Rick Rule, did an interview with him. And he's like, just look at the numbers. He's like, if you look at the average appreciation of gold over, I think it was like a 40-year time frame, the last 40 years, it's like 7 or 8% per year on average. And he's like, if you look at the real inflation number over the last 40 years, it's like 7 or 8%. So he's like, gold did exactly what you asked it to do. It didn't make you rich, but it protected money you already had. And that's the point, right? So, yeah.
Agree 100%. Mark, fantastic conversation. If people want to find out more about your company, if they want to find out more about your work, where can we send them?
Send them to swpcayman.com. It's a great website, a lot of information there. We kind of try to go in depth about all the things we talked about today: insurance, segregation, bullion ownership, all those things. We're also on social channels. We don't have a massive following, but if you want to follow us on Twitter or if you want to follow us on Facebook, we do post there, precious metals news, market updates, things like that. So, but swpcayman.com is a place to go. We also have a YouTube channel worth checking out with some great educational videos. I'm sure something that you would appreciate as well.
Well, and before our conversation, you promised me that if any of my listeners come forward and decide that they want to have international vaulting storage or they want to purchase some metals, that you guys would take extra good care of them. So feel free, guys, to just put in my name, Mikkel, or Expat Money, and the team over at SWP will take really good care of you. Okay.
And that's the truth. Mikhail, we've enjoyed the relationship with you thus far. You're a great promoter of gold and silver ownership. And yeah, we do take good care of people. That's probably why we're successful. We're not huge, we're a niche company, boutique company, but that's a good thing. That's what clients actually want. And that's what we do well.
Amazing. Mark, thank you so much for your time, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.